Well, a better way to begin with the mighty Sam Cooke striking the perfect note of optimism. And we're going to need some optimism this evening because we're addressing a question that could scarcely be more serious and looking for ways forward. So welcome to this special ThinkIn entitled How Many More People Must Die from COVID, which is part of our arms race campaign at Tortoise, which launched back in June with a podcast by our co-founder James Harding on the failure of the G7 summit at Carbis Bay to really grapple with the question of vaccine inequality. And we've really been trying since then to do all we could in journalism, coalition building, and now with our new vaccine tracker, which we'll put a link into the chat for you so you can take a look yourself, to encourage people to do all they can to get the whole world double vaccinated by the end of 2022 at the latest. I'm Matt D'Ancona, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and in the chat is my colleague Laura Spirit, who's been very closely involved with the campaign and will be interacting with you there. And if you want to speak, please do let us know. I hope that plenty of you have seen Gordon Brown's slow view on the Tortoise website today, which I think is important because it puts to bed once and for all the idea that we have to choose between, on the one hand, boosters and vaccinating children on the one hand, and two, sharing vaccines with poorer nations. We absolutely don't have to make that choice. It's a completely false dichotomy. By the end of the next month, there'll be 800 million surplus doses, all heading for expiry, which is a scandal. And by year's end, that figure will be 1 billion doses and rising fast. So what I'm hoping to do in this thinking is to zero in on the specific issue in a way of preventable deaths, which may sound like a curious thing to target, but it seems to me at the heart of where we are is how do we calculate that figure? And of course, what do we do to minimize it drastically? And we have a lineup of speakers, the like of which I can't remember, and then certainly in any thinking I've edited. Really extraordinary. Agnes Binagwaho, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity, Anthony Costello, who's the Professor of Global Health and Sustainable Development at University College London, Monica Gandhi, who's a Professor of Medicine and Specialist in HIV and Infectious Diseases based at UCSF San Francisco General Hospital, Prashant Yadav, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development, Affiliate Professor of Technology and Operations Management at NCEAT and a lecturer at Harvard Medical School. And one of our dear friends and collaborators, the great Gary Edson, who's president of the COVID Collaborative and was a Deputy National Security Advisor in the past and has played a key role in all of the developments on the vaccine inequality campaign in recent months, and perhaps especially in recent weeks, as I hope we can turn to. As ever, please join in. This is an opportunity for you to have your say, tell us what you think, and let's try and move the debate forward. I think we can all agree on the moral imperative, but we need to be looking now as the months pass at practical steps. So let me turn to Agnes first. Agnes, first of all, thank you. And how do you assess where we are today on September the 6th with the problem of vaccine inequality? I mean, what's your kind of capsule assessment of where we are?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me in this great panel. So we all know we have since 1.5 years and more that COVID-19 has not created, but highlighted existing inequalities and social inequalities as never. And it is more evident now with the COVID-19 vaccine inequities in distribution. And the way the rich countries has tried to block the expansion of global vaccine manufacturing, stucking it in debates with some developing country like the United Kingdom still slowing global vaccine distribution by opposing the licensing process under the trade-related intellectual property. While licensing can bring money to those who have discovered the product, like Coca-Cola. You know, every time somebody drink a Coca-Cola, all over the world, Coca-Cola make a profit. So it's even less ethical and less, we cannot explain that, but UK is not the only one. We have Switzerland, we have Norway. They have been accused, not by us in Africa, but by international humanitarian organizations of delaying by tactics to start licensing under existing law. So the other thing, you can see that the big manufacturer, Pfizer and Moderna, for example, have made a lot of profit, and many of them has done their discovery using also public money. And now, with all the profit they do, they still increase their profit by increasing the price by 25%. For Pfizer, 30% for Moderna. We are not concerned in the developing world yet, but we will be soon. So we have reason to be concerned. So this increase in price is currently concerning the developed country and will make those farms make more profit. It's the only objective. And it's not normal. And when we see the report of Oxfam, which shows that the cost of vaccine is 5 times more than the cost of selling the vaccine is 5 times more than the cost to do it. And they still want to increase. The cost is $1.2 per shot. They make $5 profit even when they send the vaccine to low-income countries. So, and they have taken 41 billion more to government now to sell those products below reasonable profit, because I understand their private sector, they are there to make profit, but not to make people die, to be rich at a point they cannot even use it during their lifetime. So COVAX was there based on science to distribute the vaccine to 20% of the most in need across the world to stop the spread. It was not possible because of the price, because of the overprofit, because of the nationalism of countries who vaccinate their people, even not at risk, when only now 3% of African has got 2 shots or are fully vaccinated. And it's so stupid scientifically, because we are not vaccinated. The virus will be we will face multiplication of the virus in countries where people are not vaccinated. As every time a vaccine make a variant, when a virus make a variant, a little vaccine,
like Delta, for example, or Lambda.
We have vaccine, and we are going to face quickly. We all know it. Bring me a scientist who doesn't agree on that. Soon, we are going to have a variant that doesn't respond to any vaccine. So this variant will bounce back to the rich country who are over-vaccinated. Their people go for 3 shots now. 3 shots, 4 shots, 5 shots will not protect them. They will die anyway. So we should go by equity. We should go by science. And without that, the world is not in a good shape. And it's the first time the world faced such a situation where the pseudo goodwill of the rich people is seen for what it is in reality, and the greed of big pharma is seen what it is in reality, and they show us also who lead the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean, just looking at the map that we've developed in the vaccine tracker, which is still in beta at Tortoise, it's quite clear that Africa is the continent that is now, a gaping wound in this whole story. Levels of vaccination of 2% or less. So the question, Agnes, is what do we do now, today, this week, to address that problem? Because people are dying, at least 10,000 a day, probably a lot more in the light of more recent calculations by The Economist and others. Where you've talked about Big Pharma, you've talked about the weakness of COVAX faced with Big Pharma. What needs to be done to break that cycle?
I think we need wealthy nation to first and urgently contribute to supply COVAX as it was designed in early 2020. And also, because all the rich country has more doses in stock than they will use. For instance, the United States was estimated to have 500 million of surplus doses, and countries like Switzerland, Canada have enough doses to vaccinate the entire population 5 times. And those vaccines are not used now when they can turn the future of this pandemic for the world. And also in parallel, so they should distribute that through COVAX immediately, and also to countries who are ready to use it, and help other countries who are not ready to be ready. So countries should also avoid providing unnecessary booster shots to those who are not needing it, because it will not protect them for the variant that is coming, and that will come from people who are not vaccinated. Moreover, this will solve nothing if we do that. Furthermore, because pharmaceutical firm doesn't respect the rule of market either, because when country like mine pay for a vaccine before a rich country, we are not served. They serve the procurement process started after us by a rich country. So this is not the law. The rich people come together, give us law that serve them. When it doesn't serve them, they don't respect them, and all the world doesn't work. Example is so bad. So now, this is something, distribute immediately the surplus the countries have. Second, help immediately countries that are ready to manufacture. And also understand that we are not blind. Big pharma are not in favor for us to manufacture medical products, vaccine or others, because they want to keep us a virgin market, always begging and buying to them, not be self-sufficient and do what we want. I wish that rich countries have the political courage to face science, reality, and humanity.
Thank you, Agnes. Let me come to Anthony Costello. Anthony, you've been on top of this since really the whole thing started. And I wonder if we can kind of, as it were, get granular and ask how do we drill into the Toronto figures that are now emerging? They're patchy in some countries, but we're starting to get a workable database. We've been working on the very, very shorthand basis that 10,000 deaths a day happening as a consequence of COVID. Do you think, as for example, The Economist does, that the real figure is much higher?
Yes, I do. So when the Delta broke in India, and I was on a call with a group of Indian colleagues back in early May, I think it was, and they said it's terrible what's going on in Delhi right now. We're short of oxygen, short of ICU beds, and I said, is anybody that's vaccinated getting the illness? And they laughed. They said, well, lots of us have had it. And 3 of us have been there's 3 out of 15 have been in hospital. And they said 244 doctors in Delhi had died in the last month, of which 7 were fully vaccinated. So they knew already. And I said, well, what's the true scale of this? And I spoke to somebody who I really respect, who knows a lot about India. He said, listen, the official statistics we compared them with the cremation reports, because they are fairly accurate. When somebody goes to, be cremated, they keep a record. And they thought it was a factor of 10 difference. And Prasanta's going to talk later, so I won't steal his thunder, because they've done a very nice review of the estimates. But basically, it's something like that there are huge underreporting of deaths. And we've known this for years, that maternal mortality in most countries is estimated using pretty crude techniques of guessing, basically, based on other mortality rates. And we did a study once in Malawi where we looked at a district in detail, and the official statistics said there had been 29 maternal deaths in that year. And when we went round and interviewed all the village committees and stuff, we discovered that there were near as 60. So death reporting in most parts of the world actually is still not the law, and it's not followed properly. So you have to make guesstimates, and that becomes quite difficult. I mean, one thing, I'm not a modeler, but I've learned that, models are only as good as the assumptions you can make. It's difficult. In this country, predicting what's going to happen next is difficult, because we don't know how long immunity is going to last, and the components of it. How long will immunity last to protect against death, the immunity that protects against hospitalization, and the immunity, which isn't very good, that protects against infection. And we know there are many breakthrough infections. I've had a breakthrough COVID, and I've had some long COVID symptoms, so I know about this. And then there's the question, will 3 doses make the difference for prolonged immunity? Will we need annual boosters? People talk about what's called the endemic equilibrium. What's it going to look like? Will there be winter surges like flu? Will it be worse than flu? A lot of flu deaths, I think, are a bit overestimated, because often they're confused with other viruses and other causes of pneumonia. So when you get to globally to try and estimate deaths, for all the reasons I've said, but then there are some plus factors. If you're in Africa or India, the proportion of the population that are over 65 is very different. In our country, it's about 18%. In India, I think it's 6%. So that should favor their death rate. But then again, they're rural populations. They're living out in the open in warm climates. So that should favor them. On the other hand, if you've got poor nutrition, if you don't have a vaccine, if you don't have access to oxygen, to ICU beds. So you have to factor all of this in. And in fact, when you invited me on, I had a chat with Carl Friston, who's the most cited scientist in the UK, who's a modeler, and he's going to look at some of, use his model to make projections. But I'm sure Prasant will talk a little bit about what they've done, which is really interesting at the Centre for Global Development.
I mean, just to stick with that for a second, Anthony. I mean, the question is how we get there. So Cambridge and Public Health England, as many people on this call will know, have calculated that so far vaccinations in England have prevented between 102,000 and 109,500 lives being lost. So let's flip that. How do we get to a data point which we can present with confidence that says, given vaccine availability, which I think we can all agree is real, even if it hasn't been enacted for reasons Agnes and others have mentioned, how many deaths in each country could be reasonably prevented? Is that data point reachable?
Well, it would be an estimate with some pretty broad confidence intervals, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, you well know, Matthew, that over the past year or more, 18 months, we've had a variety of estimates. And of course, all models are wrong in a sense, but it depends how wrong they are. And Carl Friston, who does a different kind of modeling from the epidemiologist, set up one last November and got it wildly wrong because he didn't anticipate the emergence of a new variant. And to a certain extent, all models will face this. But we can, I think, make some intelligent guesses about, for example, what is the impact of these crazy, it's the end of multilateralism. It's the kind of free market corruption that we're seeing, because what we have are publicly funded, university-led research that's been hijacked by some companies. And, you know, when the President of the United States, President of France, World Trade Organization chief, WHO all say, let's have a patent waiver. India, South Africa, Kenya asked for this last October before the vaccines were ready. And yet Germany, UK, Canada vetoed it, and others. So, and because of that, we can't get, you know, a vaccine out to people around the world. Listen, I'm old enough. When I was at primary school, I was one of the first cohort to get polio vaccine. And there was a boy in 2 years ahead of me who had a gammy leg. And, you know, it was fantastic to get the polio vaccine. My mother was delighted and all the rest of it. And they asked Jonas Salk, the inventor of that vaccine, they said, why didn't you get a patent? He said, can you patent the sun? And, you know, it's been a tradition at Oxford and Cambridge up until about 15 years ago that you would never seek patents. Or that's what I'm told. But now, of course, it's all changed and everything's free market. And it's an obscenity, really, because I think it is going to be in the millions of lives that are lost for want of global coordinated action.
This is very sobering. Can I come in that light to Gary? Gary, you've been, you know, very involved recently. We saw an excellent piece you, Pascal, Ami, and others wrote for taught us about the 6-point plan for a summit we hope will now go ahead, perhaps during the UN General Assembly, which opens on September the 14th, convened by President Biden. How, you know, I mean, tell us a little bit about that plan, and also how it might unlock some of the pathologies and problems we've been hearing about already.
Well, I think that to begin with, what Anthony was saying, we need a global coordinated action-oriented response, and that's been lacking. There's been a lack of leadership. The global response architecture is fragmented. You've got COVAX and ACT-A and Gavi, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and it's fragmented. It's unproven still at scale. And it lacks a coordinated global response with all of the high-income countries as well as part of the process. So what we've called for is an action-forcing event to get global leaders to agree to commit to the goal of vaccinating 70% of the global population by mid-2022, and to make a sufficient supply available to do that. 7 billion doses this year, another 7 billion doses by mid-2022, and equally, if not more importantly, to universally ensure that by the end of this year, countries are ready, vaccine ready, to scale up adult vaccination of populations on a national scale, something that most low and middle income countries haven't done. And in fact, what we're seeing is that supply is ramping up, and that the real constraint in the race between vaccines and variants is going to be countries' distribution and delivery capacity. So we need a concerted effort to not only increase supply, and I'll get back to that in a second, but also to strengthen countries' distribution, delivery, and demand generation capabilities, so they can translate doses into shots in the arm. In terms of increasing supply, we need to ramp up manufacturing further. We need to share doses, as was mentioned, because there are excess doses. Our calculations show that the United States will have about 1 billion excess doses soon, and those doses should be shared, and the US, I think, should lead by example, but other high-income countries need to do the same. And we need to create manufacturing capacity in low and middle-income countries themselves, not only to address the current crisis, but so that we have that capacity to address future crises as well. Now, I must say, that I think the talk about the patent waiver in through the WTO is a red herring. I was general counsel to the US Trade Representative. I've seen these fights before. And first of all, this is going to be a long fight if that waiver is ever granted. And a lot of time is going to be wasted when lives could be saved. Secondly, the patent waiver alone is simply like releasing a very complex recipe into the world. It takes very sophisticated manufacturing know-how to produce these vaccines reliably and safely. And what that means with a patent waiver is you get the recipe, but you don't get the chef. And in order to get the chef, what you need is voluntary licensing and technological transfer. And that's been occurring. The United States, through the Development Finance Corporation, for example, has already made 3 investments in Senegal, South Africa, and India to expand manufacturing capacity in those countries for use in those countries and in surrounding regions. And that's the kind of robust response that we're going to need if we're going to increase supply and sufficiently and quickly enough so that we can prevent those deaths that you've been talking about.
So, Gary, the question that one wants to ask then is, assuming there is the summit, which we all hope will happen during UNGA, perhaps around September the 20th, not quite clear yet, is the outcome of that a beefing up of COVAX, a replacement of COVAX, someone being put at the helm of COVAX who has real global reach and is able to put it sort of crudely, pick up the phone to world leaders and say, why aren't you using why aren't you supplying these surplus doses where they are needed? I mean, what is the institutional outcome of the summit, ideally?
Well, I think the institutional outcome is that we need a better leadership structure in place. We proposed, for example, the appointment of a UN Special Envoy to work with the Multilateral Leaders Task Force, to work with COVAX and the World Health Organization, but to lead a global response. I think that the high-income countries themselves need to step up. The US needs to lead on this in the same way that it led on HIV. And that means not only to support the multilateral response, but to augment it through bilateral initiatives. Just as PEPFAR augmented the global response to HIV, I think we should be launching initiatives to augment the global response to COVID. I think that the combination of those things, together with the establishment of clear goals and benchmarks of progress, so that we can hold countries accountable, is going to be a critical outcome of such a summit, and to have countries buy into that. And then to have a fully costed roadmap from A to Z of what it's going to take to bring about an end to the acute phase of the pandemic. We don't have that as it stands. In fact, to a certain extent, I'd argue that COVAX aimed too low to begin with the 20% coverage being its initial target. It should have aimed at 70 or 80% coverage, and then you work backwards from that to delineate the steps and the actions that are necessary to get there, and to ensure a more coordinated global response.
Thank you, Gary. Can I come to Monica now? Monica, are you there? Welcome. How are you?
Sorry, I think it was still on mute.
Great to see you. Thank you for being here. I suppose so many questions to ask, but one that occurs given what we've been talking about, the problems that Africa has experienced is a narrow one, which is about the impact of the Indian export ban upon all this. Can you talk us through that? Because it seems to me a factor that's very important, and it is reported, but I'm not sure how widely it's appreciated.
Yes, I mean, I wrote this piece in time that I sort of try to give the history of inequity with antiretroviral access that seems to be mirroring what's going on with vaccine access inequity with COVID-19. The problem is that we took years to figure it out with antiretroviral access, and actually it was India who ended up sort of saving the day with antiretrovirals. And what happened in the late 90s essentially is we had these very highly effective antiretroviral therapies. There were call for waiving of patents for these medications because the bulk of the people who were dying were in sub-Saharan Africa. That was still 2/3 of the epidemic with HIV. And it took years and years. Pfizer at the time was actually charging so high for fluconazole. They made $1 billion in 1998, but they were charging so high for just a simple medication for cryptococcal meningitis that finally India essentially decided, and it was a very deliberate thing, to make the medications at less than $1 a day, the antiretroviral medications. South Africa started purchasing those medications from India and was actually temporarily sued by large pharmaceutical companies saying they were too cheap. And luckily, because of public pressure, that suit was dropped. And so at this point, there really is, India was really, at the time for us in HIV medicine, sort of a hero of the HIV epidemic in terms of producing high quality antiretrovirals at relatively low cost, less than $1 a day. So when India was hit by the Delta variant early in March, and you're right, it was horrific and shows the power of the Delta variant in a population that had a 4% vaccination rate as compared to the UK, who got it later and had a 76% vaccination rate in terms of deaths. There's no doubt that India at that time, even though they'd appealed in October 2020, as we were just talking about, knowing that somehow this was clear that without vaccine equity, there was going to be there was a likelihood for terrible death and suffering, and that's exactly what happened. And at the time, pharmaceutical companies wrote a open letter to the Biden administration in March of 2021 saying, I'm glad that was opposed, the waiving of the patents. So India now has banned exports of its own vaccines for its own and keeping to its own population. This is Covaxin, and also have the capability of making the Covishield, the AstraZeneca. And India, this has an effect on sub-Saharan Africa, because while we're waiting for rich countries to take any sort of lead in global public health, which, by the way, would give them huge credibility, would give our new administration huge credibility if we became a global health leader by helping with distribution of our 1 billion doses, talking fewer about boosters and more about preventing death globally. But while we're waiting for that, I think India has always, at least with HIV, had a huge role to play, has a lot of capacity, and I think is a place to look to for the possibility of, if they stop the export ban, thinking about providing vaccines for the world. Covaxin is actually a very good product. It's a whole inactivated virion, and it does have a lot of advantages.
So, I mean, to revert to my fixation of the evening, as a thought experiment, if you had all the data available at your fingertips, how would you construct a preventable death data point? Which I think, and the reason I ask is because I think that is a terribly important tool in this whole debate, which is the notion that there are vaccines available. The money involved is a rounding error compared to the COVID recovery programs the West has put into place. We just need to get them where they are. And the preventable death data point, if we could get it, would, I think, illustrate to people, how unconscionable the consequence of where we are is. So I suppose my question to you, Monica, is, if you could, how would you get to that form of data analysis?
I mean, so one way is completely support the UN meeting and love the COVID collaborative and very impressed with their work. And at that meeting, which we should work as hard as we can to make happen, there are actually strategic ways to distribute vaccine that is different than how we're distributing it here. So the strategic ways to distribute vaccine is not actually first to give it to people who have had prior COVID infection, because natural immunity has some protection for some time. So there are when you have a limited supply, there are very strategic ways to give it. Not to people who've had natural COVID infection, of course, starting with age groups, of course, starting with healthcare workers, of course, starting with people who are most vulnerable. Take a limited supply and strategically distribute it, as opposed to just giving this many doses to this country and this many doses to this country. That is how we should eventually get to 11 billion doses. But right now, it's about strategically distributing the dosages so that we maximize the impact to prevent death. And a 40-year-old who has had COVID is absolutely less likely to die and will have some time with their natural protective immunity prior to even a 30-year-old or a 40-year-old who has not had COVID. So it's a matter of, I wrote an article in the San Francisco Chronicle about this, but it's a matter of being extremely strategic when you have a limited supply about how many doses to give to countries and asking them to distribute them among those different strategic principles to maximize the prevention of death as we get more global manufacturing and as we get, I hope, our rich countries to take responsibility.
Thank you so much, Monica. We'll come back to you. Can I come to Prashant? And Prashant, I mean, you are, to some extent, the Yoda of all this. Tell us how we get to the form of analysis that we're chasing.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So two things. Firstly, I am a technician in much of this. So I do nuts and bolts types of things of how manufacturing capacity is to be expanded, how distribution has to be expanded, what kind of deployment models, similar to what Monica is talking about. I don't necessarily work on building large epi models. A couple of things I would remind as we are thinking about the estimation methods. One is, Tony Costello was talking about the study that Center for Global Development did on estimating deaths in India. I put out a link for that. I think we also have to keep in mind that in estimating preventable deaths, we have to model other things. And it's a useful and in a way, sombering reminder that while vaccines are important, access to vaccines is the most crucial thing we should address, we cannot forget that we also have to worry about access to therapeutic options, whether it is monoclonal antibodies or some of the newer promising antivirals or other drugs, whether it is about manufacturing them at larger capacity or making sure that whatever limited capacity we have in the short term, that is provided in an equitable manner to countries around the world. And how well that is done will, in a way, also go into the modeling that looks at number of preventable deaths. And in addition, other measures, non-pharmaceutical interventions, how well are they followed alongside with vaccination? I think those are important considerations to keep in mind if we want to get to be very precise about country by country estimates of this. The things I want to remind us of is that our first and foremost goal should be about expanding manufacturing capacity, in my opinion, because that's our medium-term and long-term play that is going to allow us to have some resilience in case we need a new antigen matched. We need different kinds of vaccine variant changes or new capacity to even cope with the needs for third or additional booster doses or things of that nature. So I think we've been talking about this for the last 8 or 9 months that we need more manufacturing capacity. And while the IP issue may be important in the long term, I think it tends to derail an immediate need we have, which is to start thinking about how can governments, country governments in high-income world, help create new manufacturing capacity in regions of the world that don't have it. And the recent examples of Germany some other countries working with, whether it's BioNTech or Pfizer or other companies, to create additional plans for manufacturing capacity expansion in Africa and other parts of the world. I think that's a pathway we need to expand with much more involvement from high-income country governments who do have some ability to nudge or push the companies in question to say, you have to think about this much more actively than you have been doing so far. So that's the first part. The second is access to vaccine doses is not sufficient. I think Gary Edson highlighted this. I think many of us who worked on this have reminded people that even the couple 100 million doses of donations that have now been given to COVAX, we don't see them get into clinics or as shots in arms that quickly as we would all like them to be. And there is a deployment infrastructure that has many things, people infrastructure, soft things that we need to worry about, cold chain equipment, transport, many of these systemic infrastructure things that take very long to build. And we've been in this for 18 months, and it baffles many of us to say we are not ready in large numbers of countries with the right deployment architecture, with the right set of planning models. And I understand it's hard to do planning when you don't really know what is coming your way, which product, when. But nevertheless, I think that's another area which sometimes we overlook in the global conversation about access. And I want to just remind us that it's extremely important, equally crucial for us to work out a plan for it. And I fully support the idea that if there is a UNGA conjunctive summit on this, in addition to thinking about redistributing current doses, expanding manufacturing capacity, it should also think about how do we resource, and by resource, I mean both in terms of financial resources and technical resources, to create a deployment system that can absorb vaccines quickly, rapidly, expeditiously, and equitably in ways that are strategic, like Monica highlighted. And I don't think we are close to that in a large number of countries.
So, as I mentioned at the top, Tortoise's interest in this started with James's newscast on the abject failure of the Carbis Bay G7 meeting on vaccine equalization. Here we are, approaching the middle of September in Unga, and the possibility of a summit hosted by President Biden. Prashant, what's the trajectory of your mood? Are you feeling more or less optimistic?
So it's a mixed bag. I think on some parts, I feel very optimistic. I think the idea that we have at least initiated dose sharing and hundreds of millions of doses are now going to COVAX is an encouraging sign. I am disappointed that in September, we are still talking about dose reallocations that lie in the hundreds of millions and are nowhere getting close to the more than 1 billion doses, which we can very safely reallocate without having to compromise third doses, booster doses, anything else. So that's somewhat disappointing. The second part, which I feel slightly disappointed by, is that the discussion on expanding manufacturing capacity is moving very, very slowly. We aren't seeing very quick action to say, here is a plant, here is how we can get it to start producing in 9 months from now, 8 months from now. Here are the kinds of things we want to bring together. And in that, I also want to remind us that national regulatory capacity and strengthening that and making sure that they can do lot verification, lot release, those kinds of very technical manufacturing things are also embedded in that. So those are things I'm hoping the summit can address in a systematic manner. But I think if the summit ends up being another gathering and convening where we talk a lot about what we will do, but don't define operational and tactical concrete actions, I feel I will continue to remain disappointed.
Thank you, Prashant. I'd like to go to Emma J now, if I may. Emma, are you there?
I am.
Hi, can we see you on screen, or is it?
No, you can see me on screen.
There we go. Thanks so much for coming. You had a very interesting suggestion about how a step that would be very straightforward to take that would perhaps raise public consciousness on, how much how much is being done or not done on this front?
I just suggested that maybe in the dashboard or in the reporting of figures, when we hear daily or weekly what advances have been done on vaccination, we also demanded that there should be, or requested more politely, that there should be an update on our distribution figures as well overseas.
Do you think people, I mean, the implication of your point is that really this is not an issue that has yet significantly crossed the public's radar. Is that fair?
I think as we were moving through the channels of vaccination about 6 months ago, it was raised as a discussion. I think it's gone quite quiet in the last 6 months. And as we got back to our new normal, we've just pushed it down.
Yes, we remain
our priority list.
Introspective. I'd like to come to Zebedee. Thank you very much. To Zebedee, if you're there. Hi, Zebedee.
Yeah, hi there. Hello.
Hello. Good to see you. You made a very interesting point about rational understanding of the risk of variance and emotional understanding of variance, i.e., well, I don't want to paraphrase what you said, but perhaps you'd like to make it.
Well, I think it's a fairly obvious point, and you know, you've pretty much said it. Basically, you know, although we can also understand that you know, the need is there and the requirement is there. You know, when it comes to it, you see that, you know, at level, governments aren't actually putting that into practice. They say that they understand that you know, variations are dangerous and so on, but they're not following that up with direct action. And why is that? You know, it doesn't make sense. If you believe in that thing happening, then, you know, you would actually take action. That's all.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I mean, the whole of our lives in the last 18 months has been, certainly after the summer of 2020, driven by variants. So you'd think that there'd be some visceral understanding that variants were a bad thing. But I'm not sure that there's any connection in people's minds about the, you know, the failure to vaccinate the poorer nations and the risk of more and more lethal variants emerging in the months to come. Oh, we've lost Zebedee. Let's go to, oh, hi, Zebedee, come back. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, I was having difficulty hearing what you said, but one other point I'd like to make is that, you know, people that I've spoken to who basically are, you know, generous with the idea of, say, you know, when you're talking about allowing refugees into the country and so on, when it comes to the issue of vaccinations and so on, they take the view that, you know, you have to attend to the needs of the UK citizenry first, you know, so you do all you can to make sure that the UK citizens are vaccinated, and then, you know, you look after the rest. And they also know that argument, you know, that you know, if you don't attend to the fact that you know, unvaccinated people will lead to variants and so on, which are more dangerous even to people in the UK. You know, they understand that and they hear that, you know, but still, you know, there are these other sort of directions that people choose to go in.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come to our co-founder, Katie Vanek-Smith, who is on an iPhone, I think. I don't know if that makes it harder for her to contribute, but I would love her to expand on a point. Hi, Katie.
Hey, can you hear me, Matt?
Yes, perfect. Great to see you. And just, you made a really good point about, I suppose, again, speaking to the empathy point and the personalization point. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little.
I mean, I think that there's a couple of things that sort of I worry about in this next phase, and thank you to everyone this evening. It's been fascinating to listen to all the experts, is that I think that for the last 15, 18 months, the whole experience of COVID has been very personal for people. And what we're talking about here is actually getting people to take a step back and think beyond the, am I double jab? Do I need a booster? Working from home, homeschooling, can I go abroad? And the whole experience of COVID for many of us in the UK and other developed and richer countries where people have had the benefit of vaccination programs has been the disruption to life. And I just think I keep coming back to the fact that I don't think the awareness is there at a public level to support all the great work that you've been talking about around how we get a fairer and equitable distribution and a rollout strategy for the world. So Tess, I'll sing to you tomorrow, Jab the World, because it is playing in my head right now. But I do think that, I don't know what the steps would be, but I do think if we could make it feel more urgent to individuals, as well as all the work that you've talked about today with the 6-step plan that Gary talked through and the hopes for UNGA and all of these other great ideas, I do think we mustn't forget that actually we need to bring the public with us as well. And I think the public understanding of what we're talking about is not where it needs to be.
Thank you, Katie. I couldn't agree more. I see that we're joined by another of our friends in this collaboration, Krishna Udayoma Kumar, who's director of the Duke Global Health Initiative, Innovation Center rather, at Duke. And Duke, as I'm sure many of you know, has been absolutely fundamental to this whole process. But Krishna, are you there? Are you there? Still waiting on Krishna. Okay, we'll come back to him. Can I go to Kim Dara, my colleague in the data team, who's had a great deal to do with getting the vaccine tracker together? And first of all, congratulations, Kim. It's fantastic. Listening to this extraordinary panel tonight, how do you feel about the prospects we have at Tortoise of being able to land a preventable death data point? Clearly it's not a straightforward ask.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think it's kind of brought up a lot of points that make it clear how difficult it will be. But I think part of what we would want to do is not necessarily have the world's most perfect model that has absolutely every single data point that you'd want to have in it. It's more just a fairly, as best as we can get with quite a simple calculation, just to bring that point home. And I don't know whether, I mean, if it was just like, you could do an extremely simple version, where you look at, the average number of people, the death rate in countries where the death rate, so where you sort of like look at the pace of vaccination that we would expect to see, or that would ideally we'd see in low-income countries, like if we tried to sort of count the expected number of deaths that we'd get if low-income countries had the same rate of vaccination as high-income countries, and we sort of found out a way to calculate the number of deaths that have already happened that wouldn't have otherwise happened. I think we could try and do that in quite a simple way. I think making a very complicated model is something that I think we should try and push for via a partnership. And yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the variant, the other kind of variants, the variables, as Pasha pointed out, that you're looking at demographics, you're looking at therapies, you're looking at oxygen availability, you're looking at a whole variety of factors that will vary radically from country to country. So that makes the job that much harder. But again, this is why it's good, I think, that the tracker is in beta, because it means that we can head towards this.
Yeah, and I think I mean, it's also the concept of preventable death is quite difficult to define, because it's like all of the deaths since the moment that we found a vaccine that works, like all of those were technically preventable in the sense that we had a vaccine at that point. But it's just the pace at which we should be going versus the pace at which we are going, and we have to define what the pace that we should be going. We need to define what that is, and we need to yeah.
No, it's clearly an ongoing experience. Horribly, we are reaching the end of the hour, which aggrieves me, because I would happily spend another hour talking to you all and this stellar panel. Just a few, one of my tasks, and I feel unequal to it really, given the expertise that has preceded this, though, is to give some sort of summary of what we've been doing, and particularly to look forward to where it takes us journalistically. And I think that there are several key points. I mean, one is that, you know, Agnes set us up brilliantly with a kind of picture of, you know, a very stark reminder that this is a problem that has its roots in the power of big pharma and the refusal of the wealthier nations at the beginning to preempt what was obviously going to be a huge problem. Not all countries as bad as others in that respect, but you know, the results are all there to see. And you know, Anthony, I think, framed it very well, which in the light of the fall of Kabul is another sort of a moment, which is that we are seeing a multilateral world turn into a world that is governed entirely by price. Now, clearly the market has a huge role to play in the global economy, but it's not sufficient in a situation like this. And it seems to me those are two of three huge facts. The third, to which Gary alluded in some detail, is that, you know, we need to look at what COVAX has done so far and accept that whatever else happens to it, it needs some form of coordinated leadership. And you know, there will, I think, and there always is, a disagreement on vaccine patent waivers, but that we shouldn't get too hung up on that in the immediate future, but concentrate on getting doses out, technology transfer, manufacturing capability, and so on. Struck too by, you know, Monica's remarks about you know, the really straightforward but terrible facts, you know, huge basic facts like the Indian export ban is distorting this, and we have to build around that, and that's it's a sobering thought, to say the least. And Prashant's point about the whole question of how we arrived at preventable death data points seemed to me to be absolutely not just important in terms of data journalism, but important in terms of our whole understanding holistically of the problem that we face, which is that it isn't just vaccines, it is access to therapeutic treatments, it is the demographics of each country, to the access to oxygen, and indeed the basic infrastructure of a country that will have a very important effect on how we judge preventable deaths. I do, however, I'm encouraged by Kim's sort of positivity that we will just keep banging away at that and trying to get a way of judging it country by country. It won't be perfect initially, but we will get there. And I've said throughout, and I'll say again, that I believe this is a campaign that will require enormous stamina and agility, two qualities that aren't necessarily associated with the international community, but we need desperately. I'd really like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Agnes, Anthony, Monica, Prashant, and Gary for giving up their extremely valuable time. There's so much more to do. Please do keep an eye on all the arms race updates and the vaccine tracker on the site. Let us know what you think we should be doing, because this is a public campaign. It's a campaign that is in its infancy in terms of public engagement. And we need help, and we need advice, and we need good ideas. So stay in touch. Thank you very much for coming, and a good evening to all of you.